difference between the political ambition and the achievement of the political ambition on the ground. And to do that, we really need to build on science, on scientific advances around 5 big areas. Here you define this figure: remote responsibility, restoration, positive futures, multidimensional change, and particularly on monitoring this progress towards these targets. The challenge, of course, is that biodiversity change is something hard to monitor, because biodiversity is all life on Earth. So how do you monitor the entire system? You have to monitor parts of the system. And you always have gaps in time and in space, in taxa, and there's limited resources for doing this. So how do you make the best use of the available data? Well, then you need to integrate data from multiple sources and target new monitoring schemes in gap areas by using biodiversity models, as proposed in the best scenarios and models assessment a few years ago. And that's where EuropaBON comes. EuropaBON has been designing a EU-wide framework for monitoring biodiversity ecosystem services. It is built on stakeholder engagement. This is really the core of this project. We started with a big user needs assessment. You can get copies of the report if you are here in presence. Outside, they are free. Just take a copy if you'd like. And then there are 3 work packages: one in assessing what exists out there, another one on co-designing the future system, and a 5th work package on illustrating how this co-design could be implemented in a couple of showcases as a demonstration. And the core idea is to use these EBV workflows where you have different data streams, integrate them into these EBV cubes that can be then used to provide indicators and scenarios for different policies. EuropaBON is not only the consortium of 15 partners. We have over 1,000 members have registered, and these members will play a key role in implementing EuropaBON in the future, and they play a key role in helping us design this biodiversity monitoring system. So what is the core idea of EuropaBON? Well, the core idea is that we select a set of essential biodiversity variables in consultation with policymakers and scientists. And then for each of these essential biodiversity variables, we design workflows that go from the data sources and data collection, where data needs to be collected, to data integration in biodiversity information infrastructures, to modeling and calculation of indicators based on those outputs of the models on what we call the EBV cubes. So how do we go about this? What are the key questions in designing EuropaBON? And if you look at this is a workflow. We have in-situ observations. Here we represent that we never have in-situ observations everywhere or in every time step. So there is always gaps. And so to fill those gaps, you need to use biodiversity models that calibrate these in-situ observations with remote sensing observations that are kind of wall-to-wall, and then you can do essential biodiversity variables for different variables. You can do these cubes wall-to-wall that are very easy to analyze. So the questions are, what are the EBVs that are needed for each policy question? So what variables you want to have these cubes for? What taxa and ecosystems? So for which taxa do you want to have these essential biodiversity variables measured? And what is the spatial and temporal resolution? Do you need this every year? Do you need this every 10 years? Do you need the resolution of 10 by 10 kilometers, or do you need 10 by 10 meters? What is the resolution you'd like to have these essential biodiversity variables data? And then after addressing these questions, then you can say, well, how do you design the sampling? Where do you need to go and sample new sites or collect information from existing sites, and what models do you use? And so EuropaBON is doing all of these steps to design this monitoring system for biodiversity in Europe. So the first step is identifying the variables. And we use a few criteria, including feasibility, policy relevance, balance across tax and realms, complementarity, and the reducibility of these variables. And based on this, we identified a set of 70 variables that go across terrestrial, freshwater, and marine, some at the species level, represented here by the darker colors, some at the community or ecosystem level, and covering major aspects at each of these levels, measure what we call classes of essential biodiversity variables. And they can be summarized in three main groups. Species level variables that are addressing questions about the status of species of conservation interest, and also for groups for which enough interest exists, even if they are not of conservation interest, they are of general interest. Ecosystem level variables that are important to assess trends in ecosystem condition and restoration across a range of taxonomic groups and ecosystems. And then as an additional set of variables that are important to assess ecological supply of ecosystem services and also ecological risks, including invasive species. So let me give you an example of how these essential biodiversity variables map to policy needs. For instance, this is the Article 17 habitats reporting for species. It says in the Article 17 that we need to assess the conservation status of species in terms of range, population, habitat for the species, and future prospects. And this has to be done for species in the marine realm and terrestrial realm and freshwater realm. The EBVs that we are using here to do this is species distribution that is possible for many of these species. In some cases, we can go and have species abundance monitored. And these already fit to three of the three parameters. You can estimate these three parameters based either on species distribution or ideally in species abundance when you have it. And genetic diversity can also be used to look at for future prospects of the populations. And you need to choose the taxonomic groups for which you do that. And depending on the taxonomic group, you may go into more details. So genetic diversity, for instance, we may only be able to do for selected priority species because it's, let's say, the most demanding in terms of costs for monitoring. Species abundance we may do for priority species, and species distributions we may do for entire taxonomic groups. So based on this list of essential biodiversity variables, we have been assessing current monitoring initiatives. We built a database of monitoring initiatives. You can go to monitoring.europabon.org and check on this database, and the landscape is not very good. In reality, no country in Europe monitors all these EBVs, and most EBVs are not monitored in the majority of the countries, or not monitored well. So there are a lot of gaps right now between what will be ideal in terms of knowledge on biodiversity monitoring and what is being monitored at national level. So we are doing this analysis in more detail for each essential biodiversity variable. This is the case, for instance, we have one variable that are the butterfly populations, and there is a monitoring scheme called the European Butterfly Monitoring Scheme, and we have been assessing for each of the essential biodiversity variable what the monitoring schemes are available in terms of data collection, models, data integration, and bottlenecks. And this is the, we compose this assessment. You can see the this flower, when you have long petals, we are doing well. When you have short petals, there are major issues. with this monitoring scheme in producing the EBV. The step we are currently working on, and we will be working this year, is on, for each of these EBVs, on co-designing workflows. And this has, let's say, 5 steps. What are the data collection and sampling? What is the data integration for these? What are the models? How do you ensure the interoperability of the outputs? And what is the IT infrastructure you need for implementing these? And you can see we are already looking at some of the EBVs here in this table across each of these aspects. Finally, we are also implementing a couple of test cases of each of these EBVs, of some of these EBVs for the Birds Directive, Habitats Directive, Water Framework Directive, and for the soil policy. And in an initial assessment of the situation of the, let's say, data and monitoring for each of these policies, we found that the major challenge is that there is no open data for any of these policies in the monitoring schemes of the EBVs. And there is always also challenge to accessing the data, and there is also no networks for some of these for instance, for the habitat monitoring, we don't really have good networks in place across Europe. And so this is what we're really trying to address. We're trying to address for each of these showcases, how can you fix for some of these essential biodiversity variables, what will be needed to design workflows that will fix these major issues. And finally, the output of this will be these EBV data sets. We are developing something called the EBV Cube data standard that will be mobilized into portals and making all of these data sets available. And the final step will then be implementing these in an European Biodiversity Monitoring Center that will contribute to the very dynamic landscape that we have, taking European biodiversity monitoring programs, national biodiversity monitoring programs, in collaboration with Biodiversa Plus, and feeding into the European Environmental Agency and the Commission, European Commission in terms of policy making. Thank you for your attention.
Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you here today. I think we really missed physical meetings quite a lot. So I think it's completely different chemistry when you talk face-to-face with people rather than just seeing online faces. So I hope that we will not just have fruitful discussion in the groups, but also on the margins of the meeting. It's our pleasure also to continue discussion. It's also our pleasure to continue the discussion on the EuropaBON work. So we are grateful for EuropaBON team as well as Biodiversa Plus for organizing this event. We really feel that we need more discussions, more iterations to really come up with good products, especially the blueprint, how we should monitor biodiversity in the EU, as well as, let's call them accompanying tools or processes which should be enshrined in the proposal for the European Monitoring Center. I think you are all aware that we need more knowledge on biodiversity. I would here highlight we need more actionable knowledge. So not just any knowledge in policy making. What we really care about and what we try to prioritize is knowledge that allow us to act on the problems. So I think we are all aware of the biodiversity loss at global, European, regional, local level. To do something about it means that we need powerful information. As Enrique mentioned, we need to better utilize what exists, but we also need to create new knowledge, new data. We need to increase the observations. We need to increase the scope of those observations. We need to include more taxa. I think that is also quite clear, and this also comes from the EuropaBON discussions. In terms of the observations, where we see a critical gap is the in-situ information. So we need more field work. We need people in the field observing what lives around us, what species, what's happening with them, and that will inform then the actions, of course, in terms of the policy making. At the European level, we have European Green Deal from 2019, which significantly increased the ambition for general environment, climate change, but especially for biodiversity through the biodiversity strategy for 2030. And within the European Green Deal, we call it a twin transition, a green transition and digital transition. Within the digital transition, it's quite important to also highlight, we are also looking for green data, how to create a strategy, how to better, again, utilize what exists, but also how to cover the gaps. Under the biodiversity strategy, there is a strong focus on knowledge, and EuropaBON and Biodiversa Plus are basically product of the commitments under the biodiversity strategy. I would really like to stress today and maybe focus more on where we need more efforts, where we need more data. Of course, we want to make sure that we have very robust indicators built on the monitoring data for policy making to inform what is happening with the state and trends of biodiversity, what is the impact of our actions, where we need to do more, and of course then help us to redesign the policies to achieve the goal, which are now set for 2030. Hopefully also, as Enrique mentioned, European goals, objectives will also help to contribute to the global efforts. In terms of the indicators, it's clear, it's been already mentioned by Enrique, but I would like to stress it again. Adequate spatial and temporal resolution is absolutely key. And it's not only about the indicators, which need to be, of course, robust, it's also about mainstreaming. So we are trying to mainstream biodiversity into different sectoral policies. These are usually land management policies like agriculture, forestry, fisheries, and so on. What we need there is also to inform those stakeholders about the ecosystem services that are being provided by biodiversity. To give an example of pollinators, which are the closest to my heart and mind, but it's a very illustrative example. We would like to farmers also to have apps, applications based on very good data that comes from monitoring on pollination, state of pollination in their area. So basically to have an app that could warn them about pollination deficit. To do that, to have a really good app that they can use in field, you would need, of course, data with very good spatial temporal resolution. For them, it's not going to matter what happens 200 kilometers away. They want to know what's happening in the area of 5 to 10 kilometers, what kind of species are there, and what they can expect for their crops. So it's absolutely critical that in the environmental sector, we do our homework, that we produce qualitative information that can help us to see what's happening with the challenge, but even more, to get the ownership of those sectors on biodiversity and ecosystem services. In order to reach the challenges, the efforts of the environmental sector are not enough. We need all sectors on board. Now, we of course talk a lot about more information, better information, and so on, but we need to also mention many of the accompanying aspects that come with it. And I think Enrique already mentioned it, some of those, but for example, access to data, it's absolutely critical to be transparent and that everybody can access the data. That we have, of course, based very good models on that data. This also needs to be open and clear to everybody how we come up with these models. To ensure very good metadata. So if we're going to have different monitoring systems, this is not only about monitoring biodiversity, we're going to have monitoring of different drivers and pressures, and also impacts of human activities on biodiversity and ecosystem services. We want to integrate all these data streams together. In order to be interoperable, we need to ensure that it's quite well understood how each of those monitoring processes is operating, and metadata there will be absolutely critical. This will help us, integration of all these processes will help us to start, finally, I would say, attributing parts of the impacts to certain drivers. So we know what are the drivers, but it's extremely difficult to say what is a driver or the main driver of biodiversity decline in certain area. We do not have powerful information to do that. We can, of course, try to make some correlations to come to the causality. We are still far away from it. With that, I would like to come to the final point, and this is how we're going to do it. We're going to discuss what needs to be done, what we need to observe, but it's also important to understand how we're going to do it. And here, I would just like to mention that we are currently discussing a proposal from the Commission Nature Restoration Law. So this is the biggest piece of legislation since Habitats Directive in 1992. Many legally binding targets are therein, and monitoring aspect is extremely strong. And we are now discussing with member states, and this how really emerges as the key point. We know that monitoring is not cheap. It should be cost effective. What we always highlight, we need to both take into account costs and benefits. Not only costs, we know that if you do something new, it's going to cost, but what are the benefits? If I can go back to pollination case, in terms of monitoring, we are talking about millions. In terms of the benefits of pollination, and only small part of pollination service, crop pollination, we're talking about billions of euros. So obviously, there already, we are talking about different orders of magnitude when we compare costs and benefits. So we send quite clear message to member states and to other stakeholders, it's worth it. We definitely need to monitor better. Everybody's going to benefit from it. In terms of how, what also we see from member states coming is support. They ask for support at EU level, but of course then this needs to trickle down to national, regional, probably also local level. And that support, of course, it's quite clear what we need. We need more experts. I think we are all aware that besides biodiversity decline, we also have decline of taxonomists in particular, but also other expertise. If we don't have people who can identify species and tell us what is living around us, we can't monitor. So we are happy that we are now producing the first European red list of taxonomists, insect taxonomists. So we really scoped and scanned to see what kind of expertise do we have. Any kind of ambitious monitoring in particular, without experts in the field, it's not going to take place. We are aware of that. So we have to be cost effective. We need to increase capacity. We need to build better tools. But also what needs to be considered in a way, how do we integrate different processes from EU to national, regional, local level? In that regard, it will be critical to see what EuropaBON, together with stakeholders, through the discussions will propose for the European Monitoring Center. We know that we will need certain functions that will be need to satisfied to get the monitoring ongoing. In terms of expertise, we might need to pool expertise at EU level in the beginning before we really build national capacities. Building tools, it makes sense that we don't have each country building its own tools, but that we share the tools. That also links us to the need to standardize and harmonize methodologies. If each country has a different methodology, it's very hard to pool resources cost effectively at EU level. So we need to consider all of that. We cannot say at this point how this European Monitoring Center will materialize. Will it be one institution, one building, very tangible, or it's going to be something virtual which will be spread across different existing institutions? It's very early to say. What we would really welcome from EuropaBON, Biodiversa communities, and all the stakeholders that are with us here is to tell us which functions, which are the needs that need to be satisfied, especially at EU level. This is the most urgent priority for us. And then how this will trickle down to the local level. We really need to see data flow, how we envisage it. So from, let's say, bottom to up, how the data will flow, but also we need to see how the support could flow top down. That will be absolutely critical. Based on this proposal, what all your discussions will feed into proposal, we're going to launch, of course, internal discussion in the Commission to see how this can be done, materialized. We are in a very good position now. I mean, the European Green Deal is at its peak, I would say, but also we are already looking towards the next policy period after 2027. I know it's, some might be too early, it's 2022, but already in 2024, we're going to start discussing how the new policy financial framework of the EU will look like. And there it will be critical to come with very clear technical needs, proposals, options, well costed, with very clearly indicated value. Because for monitoring, we really need to ensure that it's clear to everybody what is the added value of that collected information in order to justify the investments. And then we will have a very good position to influence the multi-annual financial framework, which is the long-term EU budget after 2027. I think funding probably has been mentioned all the time when it comes to monitoring where the money will come from. Well, that's going to be the discussion where the money will come from. So with that being said, thanks again for inviting me to address and to highlight some key messages and concerns from our side. I'm going to stay at least half day, so I'm happy to also engage in discussion, especially on the margins during coffee breaks and lunch. I'm not sure if we have time for questions, but during the day, I'm happy to answer any questions. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Vadim. Yes, we would be happy. Is there somebody in the audience, perhaps, who would like to ask a question? Yes, please. Yeah, we have so. Now comes the fun part.
Yes. Does it work? Yes, it works. Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. My name is Egbert Rozen. I'm here on behalf of the I was wondering, law, and I think that's very interesting. We are looking at it from the perspective of the urban area. Can we do something for biodiversity in the urban area as well? So I was thinking about the system that we are going to build up or to discuss today. Can we also include the urban areas? And of course, can gardeners and landscapers play a role in monitoring the development of the biodiversity?
Definitely. I mean, we would fully agree with that. The reason why we already have targets on urban areas, and we are now discussing with member states how to go about the metrics, how to actually measure. Green area does not mean that it supports biodiversity. If you take a football field, you would not call it, let's say, a place or area where biodiversity flourishes necessarily. So we need to distinguish green areas, let's say, from biodiversity supporting areas. That's clear, so the metric is quite important. I'm not an expert on this. I mean, we have colleagues working on this. For more technical questions, I'm happy to connect you. But just to say the reason why we include urban areas, I think it's clear for everybody. More and more people live in cities. It's now more than 50%. If we want to reach out to people to raise awareness, and not just raise awareness, but also include and invite people to be part of citizen science and engage even more deeply into conservation, they need to be, of course, aware what's happening, and urban areas can definitely tangibly support biodiversity. It's more than 10% of land use, so definitely through private gardens, public areas, we have more and more urban farming, so it's really a critical area to engage people.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot. Vadim, just one question from the floor, the online floor. Carlos, there are many questions. Carlos Augusti asked, how do you feel about measuring ecosystem services in economic terms to enable its best management through a better decision-making based on the value provided by each ecosystem?
Well, we have a work on ecosystem accounting. So, and when we talk about accounting, we should be quite clear it's both accounting in the public sector and private sector. So we think it's absolutely critical. On the private sector, we develop this ecosystem accounts together with all our knowledge partners in the EU ecosystem. So that's Eurostat, European Environment Agency, of course, JRC, DG RTD, and then DG Environment. In the private sector, we try to mainstream accounting. So basically, businesses to better understand the benefits they are getting from ecosystem services, how they depend on them, and prepare in case those ecosystem services flow will be disturbed. So it's quite important for the resilience of their business. It's extremely important that they understand what's happening with that. So we do this. We have a so-called business and biodiversity platform, and we had a huge event recently. So we really promote this. There is a lot of development ongoing there. But equally important, if not more, is to develop ecosystem accounts for public authorities. So we definitely need to better measure what is wealth of a certain society or a country. It's not just in GDP terms. We definitely need, I think it's now requisite, move beyond it and also account for natural wealth. So we intensively work on that, and just in a week or so, we're going to have also quite concrete discussions with colleagues in the statistics sector. So it's still within the EU ecosystem to see how we could go about mainstreaming ecosystem accounts. So we prepare a lot of technical work, but now it's really how do you integrate it into the ongoing processes.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And to our online community, also thanks from the floor here from online. And please do keep your questions, and we will collect them also for the further discussions in the second round. Okay.
In this talk, I will shortly tell you about the project overall, and then I will lift a couple of successful examples that we have done so far in the project. So what is Finnish Ecosystem Observatory? So we have a 4-year project running, and we have about 1.5 years left still. And the idea in this whole project is to bring together scattered activities around nature monitoring. So it's a huge task, huge challenge. And the aim is to improve different elements which support research and monitoring infrastructure. And we also want to create a national cooperation model and a data platform to support different monitoring activities, assessment of state of nature, and research. And here just a bit visualizing the project from left to right. So we are dealing with bringing together data, developing monitoring methods, and data processing tools. Here on left side, sorry, wrong button. And we also want to create this national cooperation model and develop data management and data streams. But also we want to support decision making. So we are dealing with different data sets, data management, different user cases, and also policy needs. And the idea is to develop the flow from left to right, from data to information use, but also importantly, the other way around, from policy needs to different information products and even to monitoring networks. Yeah, and our project has 6 different working packages. So this is very short summary of all these. So on the bottom, we have a package concentrating on inventory data and observation networks. That's actually the work package I'm leading, so that's closer to my own work. And then we have work package on remote sensing methods and also one for biodiversity and ecosystem modeling. And above these, we have a package working on data systems and data streams. And also above that, we have a package working on different practical applications. So in this practical application package, thank you. So we have this practical application package in which the developed methods are put into practice. So there are very different kinds of applications there. And on the top is the package that is developing the use of environmental data in society and decision making. So that was PEO project in very short. And then next I will show you 3 examples of, I think, successful examples in our project. And I want to highlight that this is just a scratch of the whole project, of course. So, and these examples, I picked up these, and these are ones that are close to my work, so very subjective choice. So they are basically dealing with inventory data, observation networks, and then practical applications. And my first example is work done on roadmap for implementing environmental DNA and other molecular monitoring methods in Finland. So behind this work is a vision that we would like that molecular monitoring methods would be in routine use in less than 10 years. And this published roadmap basically tells what concrete steps do we need for that. And well, in summary, for this coordinated transition phase, we need to test these new methods alongside with traditional ones. And then we also need to standardize the methods. And we also need to promote service markets and establish a national data management system for this kind of data. It doesn't really exist yet. And in the roadmap, we describe what does it need, a timeline for the concrete actions. And what I want to highlight in this work, that it was actually pretty many experts from different organizations working on this, participating on surveys, interviews, and also writing and commenting the roadmap work. So while we did an excellent roadmap, we also established a national active network. And then my second example is a status assessment of systematic species monitoring. That is still ongoing work. It's based on interviews of experts working with these different monitoring schemes. And we have more than 75 different species monitoring schemes so far included. And perhaps the key finding in this assessment so far is that monitoring schemes are surprisingly scattered. So between different organizations, but also within organizations. So the findability of data and monitoring schemes varies a lot. And there is little interaction between these monitoring schemes and coordinators, people working with these teams. So simply, these positive effects of networking are not achieved. We should have a network. And we do also have a lack of resources in some of these monitoring schemes. And especially short-sighted funding is a problem for long-term development. And we also concentrated on new methods, either complementing the traditional methods or then completely new monitoring schemes. And we can say that there are quite many pilots running and even few established new monitorings. But the thing is that we would need more information sharing between the schemes. So in summary, we need a common network and long-term plan and long-term funding. But again, a positive thing in this work so far is clearly a thing that this process has revealed that there is a common will to collaborate and establish such a network to find synergies. So we are just now discussing who does and how do we do it in future. And then my third and last example is about biodiversity indicator automation. So as all we know, biodiversity indicators are used in decision making routinely. But the problem is that it's actually quite a lot of work to produce the indicators and update them as well. But as nowadays many of the data are openly distributed via open APIs, there is a potential to automate this work. And that is what we have done in collaboration with Luomus, Finnish Museum of Natural History, and FinBIF, which is Finnish Biodiversity Info Facility. So basically, we have been working with datasets that are produced by volunteers. And from these datasets that can be downloaded from open APIs, we have then used these in this automation project, which includes data handling, statistical analysis, and of course publishing these indicators. But importantly, we also want to publish the indicator data and the statistical model behind the indicator, so that the process would be transparent, and also that the codes are reusable, so that those can be used in other projects elsewhere. And so far, we have been able to automate a bunch of indices. I won't go into those into detail, but I'm happy to announce that these indicators and many more will be launched in our renewed indicator service, biodiversity.fi, early next year. And then, before stopping, just a few words about the future. As I mentioned, we have 1.5 years left for this project, and there is a clear need for long-term solution. And we are hoping to find a long-term solution which will be wider and equally led in collaboration between the key national stakeholders, different organizations. And well, the negotiations are running for that. And even though there's not much to conclude yet, I think we have an excellent starting point, which is the widely shared state of will to solve these challenges together. And still, if I would need to summarize these successful examples in one sentence, it would be collaborations between stakeholders. And before stopping, I want to thank our wonderful colleagues, all the FEO team, which is led by Professor Petteri Vihervaara, who is also in the audience today, and of course our numerous collaborators. And these are the names behind the presented success stories. Very productive colleagues. And of course, thank you for funding, Ministry of Environment in Finland. And with these words, I thank you for your attention. And if you are interested, please check our web pages or Twitter account. And if there's anything that you can imagine that we could maybe help you, please be in contact.
Great, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. I think it's really nice to see such an exciting example from a national member state. So it's really something to really look at, I think, for many others, to the leadership that you're showing here. We would have time for one question, perhaps, if there is a quick one. Otherwise, we will continue. Do we have anything on the chat?
Yeah, there was some interest in the website, so this is posted on the chat. So it's given by your colleague further on. So thank you also for introducing the mix between novel and traditional methods, and also within the natural history societies, and that collaboration needs to happen between the different labs. So I think that's a common theme, and I think Finland is doing great, so it's already a success story. So I hope EuropaBON can build on this as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, okay, there is one short One short question, one short answer, please. So eDNA is a perfect and novel method, but mainly for the present absence data and should be combined with common monitoring methods to receive data on the status and trends. Is this an idea, or do you have plans to replace existing methods with eDNA? Moreover, the commentary eDNA so far is expensive, thus with the budget constraints for what is that for biodiversity monitoring?
Yeah, it is a good question. So the idea is to use eDNA as alongside with the traditional methods, but also to establish new monitoring schemes, if possible, depending on the funding, of course. And yeah, I agree that it is expensive, and yeah, we need to consider that.
Thank you, but I mean, there are several things going, so I mean, there are several novel methods. There was also in EuropaBON, there was a special workshop on novel methods, and I think these are frontiers which we can integrate with traditional monitoring. So thank you. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me for this exciting conference. Very nice to meet the new faces for me. I will try to introduce a quite traditional project. It's the Pan-European Common Bird Monitoring Scheme, which is a joint project of European Bird Census Council, EBCC, and BirdLife as well. The first question might be, why birds? Why we chose birds to monitor? They are ubiquitous. As you are aware, they inhabit almost all habitats across Europe, and they are quite conspicuous, so they are well detectable. The birds have always been very popular among public, among researchers, so there is a great body of knowledge on the birds. And they also react very sensitively to the changes in their environment, and that's why they really reflect those changes in the wider environment. So that's why we really think, and we are sure that birds are good examples and good indicators. Let's try to see a bit of history. When did it all start? It was back in 1960s in Great Britain. It's not surprising. It's the country of many bird lovers and bird watchers. And the very first bird monitoring scheme started there in 1966. Quite many countries joined gradually afterwards, mainly in the 1970s. There were mainly the countries in Scandinavia. And then mainly after the year 2000, the other joined. Now it comes to the European Bird Census Council. What is it? It's an association of researchers, mainly ornithologists, experts in bird monitoring and mapping. And the main aim is to get the data from whole Europe, the data on bird distribution and bird numbers changes, and to use it for conservation of the whole environment. The EBCC is led by a board. It's completely on voluntary basis. We meet every 6 months. There are also 2 national delegates from each country in Europe. And in every 3 years, we organize a conference called Bird Numbers, where we meet all together and share the experience. In 2002, this large project called PECMS, the Pan-European Common Bird Monitoring Scheme, emerged. And its main aim was to get together all the knowledge, all the outputs of national monitoring schemes, get it together and produce supranational European outputs. Most of the national schemes, it's maybe important to point out, these national schemes are usually organized by NGOs, but sometimes also with some research institutes or universities. Today, PECBAMS is able to produce data on 170 common bird species inhabiting Europe. We gather data from 30 countries, and you can see on the map there are still some gaps, mainly in Balkans. And of course, today with the difficult political situation, also data from Belarus, Ukraine, or Russia are still lacking, despite there are some monitoring schemes starting. Today, we gather data from more than 15,000 volunteers. It's really amazing how many skilled volunteers are available in Europe, and they really spend a lot of their time to gather the data and to go to the field. How PECBAMS works. The volunteers are really crucial. These are skilled volunteers who follow the strict methodology and send the data to the national coordinators. These national coordinators are usually scientists, experts, and they produce the national data and deliver these national outputs to the central coordination unit in Prague. We also are in contact with Statistics Netherlands, who derived the statistical methods, and ECO, the Catalan Institute for Ornithology, who developed the very recent online tools. There is also a steering and technical group which oversees the whole project, and the central coordination unit then produces the annual species trends, indicators, and the reports as well. And in practice, how does it look like? You have the volunteers, they are really skilled ones, and they follow standardized methods. So they delivered structured data to the expert national coordinators. These national coordinators calculate national species trends for each species and send the data to the international coordinator. And he does the same on the international basis. So the international level looks like this. We have the national data, and we put them all together to produce the supranational species trends. And then we choose the species specific for specific habitats. So we have the lists of species inhabiting farmland, forest, and we produced indicators for these specific groups of species. The most famous probably is the Farmland Bird Indicator, FBI, which is now based on 39 species. And the last update, which will be published very soon in mid-November, already covers more than 40 years long data. It started in 1980, and now we have the data till 2021. How is the data used? As you probably are aware, the Farmland Bird Indicator was accepted by European Union as the Sustainable Development Indicator and Structural Indicator. It's also used on national level in the rural development plans, and most recently, we are also in touch with the European Commission during preparation of nature restoration law, because the Farmland Bird Indicator is also involved in this very important piece of law. Another very important output is the research. Our data were used in more than 40 research papers already published in peer-reviewed journals. Also, other organizations use our data for their reports. You can see some examples here. For example, the Living Planet Index or the European Red List of Birds used our data. But despite all these successes, we still face some problems, of course. First of all, it's lack of funding, mainly on the national level. There are still quite many national schemes lacking funding. Time to time, we still face lack of confidence, mainly, for example, from DG Agri. So they still don't like our Farmland Bird Indicators. And of course, some countries face lack of volunteers. It's always very crucial to train new volunteers, to give them the feedback and support them. Because they, as I already mentioned, they are really crucial. In the end, some short messages about the bird monitoring dataset. It's really a unique and reliable dataset on biodiversity. It's based on robust, published, and scientifically proven methods. And what it can offer is already existing tools and methodologies which we can share as an example for also other taxa. I also would like to emphasize the citizen science effect or advantage. It's quite low cost, but it's not completely for free. We need to support the national coordinators who are professionals and who do the analysis and data checks. And the main advantage of this data set is the really large coverage. It covers almost all the continent. And very briefly, what are the parts of success? Why is PECBAM such successful? You need to have really clear and robust methods. You need to have strong partners, of course. And what is very important is enthusiastic coordinators and volunteers who are keen to cooperate. Then communicate. You need to communicate your outputs, make them available. You also need to invite researchers, because publishing the scientific papers is really crucial to get the respect and credibility. And in the end, I, of course, would like to thank very much to all the volunteers, all the 15,000 of volunteers across Europe, because, as I said, we really appreciate their help and their skills. And of course, we thank to all the national coordinators, stakeholders, supporters, and funding. And I would like to thank also to you for your attention.
Thank you very much. This is really a success story, and I hope other taxa can learn from you. And I hope you can also share how you build this network, because I mean, this is a really complex network. But what I really love is that you actually came with policy relevant indicators which come in there. You already mentioned that there are some cross-sectoral collaborations, or that other sectors are interested or maybe watch this. So here are several questions from online, and if you have, if I can't see anyone at the moment at the floor. So one of the things was, I just short, how much bird ringing data are included in calculating population trends of birds in Europe, and how do you collaborate with, for example, EuroRing?
Oh, I'm sorry, how many?
Are you collaborating with the bird ringers?
Bird ringers, no, it's a separate data set. The bird ringers are really separate.
Okay,
so
well, maybe there's some opportunity. Henrik, you've got a question. Maybe you can take the ball. You have to hold it like this.
Does it work?
Yeah.
Now it works, yeah. So I do think that this is the gold standard of biodiversity monitoring schemes in Europe, is the best that we have. But at the same time, I've been many years frustrated with this issue. Why can't we solve this issue that in the equivalent system in North America, in the BBS, we have the transect data available publicly, the transect level data. It's exactly the same kind of system, volunteer-based, annual counts of all the birds, protocol-based, and so on. The only difference is that here it's coordinated by national NGOs. In the US and Canada and Mexico is coordinated by USGS, and in Canada also by, Department of the Canadian government. And we have been discussing this for many years, and there's been close to zero progress on this issue. And so I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but this is something that really I cannot understand why it hasn't been more progress on this. Yeah.
So if I understood it well, you asked me why the data are not freely accessible. Yeah, it's a really important question. The supranational data are, all of them are accessible, are open source. But the PECMs, does not own the national data. We really are responsible only for the supranational data. Many of the partners, many of the national schemes already opened the data, and some of them are already accessible, but not all of them. And the reason is mainly the funding. And you mentioned it, most of the schemes are organized by NGOs. And a lot of NGOs, unfortunately, face or struggle with lack of funding. It's an example from Spain, from Greece, and other really important monitoring schemes who still don't get long-term sustainable support for their governments, and they just struggle with funding. So the data are their wealth, they are the value they have, so they just cannot give it openly if they get no funding for it, because yes, the volunteers, they do it without any salaries, but then you have the coordinator who has to gather the data, check the data, and to make all the analysis. So it costs something. So it's the matter of funding.
So if I could just follow up here, because this is a really important issue. We're not talking about that much money. And now I turn here to Biodiversity from the Commission. It's not, the estimates are, this is a relatively cheap monitoring scheme to run. For a few €100,000 a year, you can continue this scheme and make all data available. So certainly in EuropaBON is going to be, I'm convinced it's going to be one of the recommendations. And all the data at the Transect level needs to be made available through the European Biodiversity Monitoring. But I do think that this is, the time is now. We have the nature restoration law. This indicator is a headline indicator, and I think it should be. But we have to solve this problem. Yeah.
Thank you for this question, and I can only agree. And to be honest, I also hope this start of cooperation can help improve the situation.
Hi, hi everyone, and thanks for having me today. So as I say, I'm in the nature economy team at WCMC, but I also actually used to work on a long-term marine monitoring data set, so really excited for all the talks today. So I'm trying to give an overview today of where we're at really in the kind of corporate measurement space and where these kind of two areas of corporate performance measurement and European biodiversity monitoring may kind of interface. So where are we at for corporate performance measurement? So businesses across Europe and the world are facing multiple drivers for sort of multiple pressures and drivers for assessing their performance in terms of biodiversity. And there's really loads of momentum around reporting and disclosure of your impacts and dependencies on biodiversity as a business or as a bank or a financial institutions. In response to that, there are multiple initiatives and standards emerging in this space. And in response to that, there are multiple metrics, tools, and frameworks in development or available to kind of assess your corporate performance in terms of biodiversity, but data is a commonly cited barrier. So just to give a few examples of this really quite high momentum space. So at the global level, we have the upcoming post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework discussions, and Target 15 is trying to push for mandatory disclosure on biodiversity impacts and dependencies by large businesses. At the EU level, we have the new EU Sustainable Finance Taxonomy regulations. We have the work of the European Financial Reporting Advisory Group and the development of a corporate sustainability reporting directive. And then at the sort of market and voluntary level, we have this new thing called the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, which is a global market-led initiative to try and come up with a framework for standardized assessment of impacts and dependencies on nature. So businesses are facing all of this almost happening at once, and it's quite kind of overwhelming. So at WCMC, I lead a project with partners across Europe, including Arcadis, ICF, and the Capitals Coalition, called the Align Project, where we try and kind of cut through a lot of this complexity. So when you boil all of these different initiatives down, we get to these quite kind of core contexts for business measurement of biodiversity. So businesses might need biodiversity data to screen risks and opportunities. And this kind of needs kind of static data. So often these might be done through regional global biodiversity maps, but doesn't necessarily need to have that dynamic element of changing through time. It's just a screening process. But then after that, they might move towards actual measurements, so understanding their realized actual impacts on the ground. And this would need data that kind of changes over time to be able to track performance. And they will also look for biodiversity data to help assess their dependencies on nature. And I'll come into that in a second. And this happens at different scales. So we have businesses that have most of their impacts in their direct operations. This might be a mine or an oil or gas well. So this is the measurement at the site or project level. But you also have measurement outside your direct control, so across your value chain. So an agricultural company might have most of their impacts at the base of their supply chain, for example. So it's really important to think when we think about business and their use of biodiversity data, what are the decisions they're making and what questions are they actually trying to answer? So for this kind of screening context, they might be asking things like, where does my business interface with nature? What are the species and ecosystems that we interact with at our operation sites? What is the relative importance of those natural assets and what condition are they in? And what are our potential impacts on nature? But then when we move to measuring and tracking performance, we might ask, what are the actual realized impacts on nature on the ground? I apologize for these slightly non-European biodiversity images. What do our impacts mean for our business value and the services society depends on? Are changes in biodiversity attributable to our activity within the landscape or someone else's or a different driver? And are we reducing our impact in line with our targets and regional targets? And then when we talk about dependency, so this is how businesses use ecosystem services and rely on ecosystem services for their operations. They might ask, what are the ecosystem services we depend on for our business to operate? Which are the ecosystems and other natural capital assets that support these services where we operate? And really importantly, what are the condition of these assets and these ecosystems? Are they declining? And does this decline affect their potential for supplying ecosystem services and therefore pose a risk for our business? So we had an example, for example, earlier of declining pollinators. So with this Align project and our work at WCMC, we try and work out, okay, what should businesses be measuring and what data is available and how should they be doing it and what data is available? So when we come to what aspects of measure should businesses be screening and measure, we've already spoken about the EBVs earlier, and this is a kind of diagram that we pulled together that pulls together lots of different frameworks such as the EBVs to try and kind of show that when businesses are measuring biodiversity, their impacts on biodiversity, they actually need to be thinking about genetic, species and ecosystem level. At species, they could be thinking about their contribution to extinction risk or population size changes. At the ecosystem level, and these core variables of extent and condition, and even condition, thinking about structure, composition and functioning. So there's lots of obviously different aspects to biodiversity. And for each of them, businesses could screen and measure their pressures on these different aspects. They can measure the state directly, and they can also measure their management responses for these impacts and dependencies. So then when we move on from the what should they measure to the how, if we think about state measurement, there's kind of different types of data that businesses use or collect. So these are kind of categorized as primary data. So this is where it's collected on the ground for the purpose of an assessment. And this is often done mainly by site-based companies. So for example, the EIA process, Environmental Impact Assessment. This also might include eDNA, bioacoustics. And this is where one of the points I wanted to make is that I think private sector on-the-ground data is still a very largely untapped source of monitoring data for these kind of European programs. On-the-ground biodiversity data is collected every day for these kind of monitoring. Businesses may use secondary biodiversity state data, so this is where it's collected for other purposes, but then still used for their assessments. This might be maps, geospatial data layers, and then modeled data. So this is where businesses estimate their impacts based on their pressures. And what we need is monitoring data to improve these models to understand the characteristic impacts of these pressures on biodiversity state. And then when we have these different types of data, we can think about their spatial precision, their accuracy, their responsiveness to change. So do they change if a business went and did something differently? Would the data show a change? And are they feasible to apply at scale? So we need different data for your sites as you would across your whole supply chain. And then when we have these different characteristics, we can match them to different approaches. So for example, an in situ population count will have high precision, high accuracy, but maybe lower feasibility to apply at scale. Versus all the way to the other end, if you're using models, they might have low spatial accuracy and low precision, but much more applicable to apply across your whole global value chain. So I'm not going to go through these criteria, but through the Align project, what we're trying to do is come up with agreed across their kind of community of technical practitioners, kind of criteria for what people should be measuring and how in these different contexts. So screening and measuring at site, you might look at potential presence of species and ecosystems, but you might also, for best practice, move towards kind of understanding their extinction risk. You might measure sector average impact drivers to estimate your impacts, but for best practice, you might look at actual pressures on the ground and use much more detailed models. So we try and split between this good practice and best practice. But these recommendations will be launched later in the year at COP15, so we can share a link later. I don't want to go through this quite complicated table now. But we also have a similar thing for supply chains. So again, supply chains is largely model-based, and we might think about the data that's needed to inform these different models. So I'm aware that was quite quick, but I'm also aware I'm kind of a gatekeeper to coffee here, so I didn't want to take too much time. But in terms of some take-home messages that are really important, as I said, businesses are facing these increasing policy drivers to assess their performance in relation to biodiversity. This biodiversity measurement by business can be broadly broken down into screening risk, so this kind of static data, and measuring performance, which needs more dynamic and in-depth data. Data availability and accessibility by businesses is a commonly cited barrier for performance assessment. The degree to which state should be measured to understand performance will likely vary by context. So site-level companies are much more expected to actually measure the state of biodiversity and what's happening than, for example, a large company with a supply chain where measuring state is just really, really challenging, and they might rely more on understanding their pressures or their management responses. And especially these site-based sectors are still a largely untapped resource of on-the-ground biodiversity data. So yeah, that's all from me. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Jacob. There is a question. I first take you. Yeah. Let's keep it short and short answer. Thank you. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for this talk. I just have a question. You mentioned here that data availability and accessibility is a commonly cited barrier for performance assessment by businesses. So one issue is also that the data that's collected for these businesses or by these businesses is often not accessible publicly. Do you have any?
So it's this two-way thing, yeah. So there are lots of initiatives on kind of repositories and trying to encourage businesses to put their data openly. But obviously, a lot of businesses are probably quite wary of doing that in case of there's reputational issues. So I think it's just getting away from, we want to make it better that people disclose on their impacts rather than it, to try and encourage that to happen. And obviously, not all biodiversity monitoring data is going to be useful for businesses. So in terms of them, it's trying to understand exactly what data businesses need and where monitoring data that's more public or national can feed into those decisions. And I actually think this kind of screening is where it really, really helps, because obviously with a national data, for example, you might not be able to attribute your specific business activity to what's causing the change, but it can help you understand what's going on in the system that you're operating in and how that might affect you. So I think, but the challenge again is that sort of access issue, and obviously large businesses have the resources to pay for data, but actually a lot of businesses, their resourcing for their sustainability departments is still a limit, and so that kind of access to open data is still an issue for businesses as well. Does that help?
Thanks a lot. This is fascinating. Harik, you still have a question? Maybe you can pass this. You can just throw it. It's okay.
Okay. No, this was a wonderful presentation, Jacob, and it's really timely as we have this discussion this afternoon on how to engage businesses in European biodiversity monitoring and so on. One thing that I didn't see mentioned, the supply chain, but I think for large companies is possible, is formal life cycle assessment of their supply chain, where they really estimate what's called these characterization factors for, for their impact of different steps on biodiversity and so on. Yeah. And so I don't know if you have any formal recommendations in this report, or if you're going to mention it at the COP in a few weeks. Yeah.
Yeah, so that was my kind of modeled state based on pressure. So life cycle assessment would include that. But often with that, we know that the data actually behind those models is often has quite a lot of data gaps, spatial data gaps. Is often sometimes based on very few studies to get those characterization factors. So I actually think having better monitoring data to feed into those characterization factors is one of those routes where these kind of two fields really overlap.
The morning session, we have 2 presentations and 1 roundtable discussion. And we have a first presentation coming up by our speaker, Joachim Meys, who's a policy analyst at the European Commission at DG Regio. And before that, he worked at the JRC, and he's been part of this project, EuropaBON, from the beginning. And yeah, Joachim, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Jessie. I mean, it's really an honor to be introduced twice to this meeting. So thank you. Thank you for that. So indeed, as Jessie said, when we designed EuropaBON in 2019, we immediately, introduced the idea of working on a specific task that has to dedicated to setting up sort of coordination mechanism for biodiversity monitoring in Europe. And that was mainly to solve an essential paradox that we see if it comes to biodiversity monitoring. Many of you might recognize this map. It comes from GBIF. It's the sort of, these are the human observations that are currently in the database. And you see this bright spot in the middle of the globe, which is Europe, very much united in biodiversity monitoring. There's no weird hole in the middle of it, which usually represents Switzerland because it's outside of the EU. No, it isn't. In fact, 2 weeks ago, we had a meeting in Brussels with the Swiss embassy, and Swiss scientists were invited there. Also representatives from the government. They are very interested to collaborate with us, EuropaBON, Biodiversa, to further develop common biodiversity monitoring across Europe. Even more striking, no question of Brexit on this map. I take the example of the birds monitoring, where the UK, together with its European partners, is leading. And I think we should do this as well for biodiversity monitoring in the future. Also, other countries, Iceland, the Balkans, very much connected. So that's good to know. So sort of the conclusion is Europe is over-observed if it comes to biodiversity. But then at the same time in 2019, the European Commission, together with the European Environment Agency, we did this European EU ecosystem assessment where we were looking for spatially explicit, regularly updated data on the state of ecosystems in Europe. We found some 130 unique indicators, 2 of which are direct species-related observations, which are the birds and the butterflies. So in a way, you can say that the whole EU's biodiversity policy is based on 2 species indicators, which of course makes it also easy for other stakeholders, agriculture, developers, to not agree, to disagree with 2 indicators. There is no sort of consistent, coherent story if it comes to biodiversity. The top challenges, something that we investigated with EuropaBON, you find the reports outside at the desk. Inaccessible and insufficient raw data. Here I specifically refer to the Water Framework Directive. I mean, Europe must be the continent with the most data on fish, macroinvertebrates, water plants, and other biota because of the Water Framework Directive set in place in 2000. But yet, find me the distribution of fish species across Europe. I mean, the data is there, but it's not accessible. It's not reported. So there is a huge gap. We know that everything is collected, all the material is collected, but we just don't have access to the data. Unharmonized measurements and indicators. Here I refer to the Habitats Directive. I mean, although it is a cornerstone and a huge success for EU biodiversity policy, I mean, if you take the data on habitats and species and you put them together on a European map, you just see countries actually emerging because there's no sort of harmonized system to report on habitats and on species protected under the directives. I mean, we sufficiently talked today about reporting and financial burdens, that there's more finance necessary. I mean, if I learned one thing from the pandemic and our response on the crisis is that there is no shortage of money. So if governments want to spend, they do. So if they want to spend on biodiversity, they can. I think at Commission level or maybe also at national levels, there seems to be a confusing network of knowledge holders. So the landscape is of course very diverse with different actors who hold data on biodiversity. And currently, we don't have an IT infrastructure in place for monitoring. Some of the solutions, and these are, I mean, these are solutions, I think that they obviously don't qualify only for biodiversity monitoring. They qualify also for issues in transport, in economy, and in many other issues. And these are solutions that actually justify the reason why we have a European Union or a United Nations. Many of these solutions just work better if you do them collectively. A better coordination standards. Here I specifically refer to the work of the UN on ecosystem accounting, where we have developed standards on how to measure the extent and the condition of ecosystems, how to measure the flows of ecosystem services to the economy. We have been trying also, and there's huge interest to do that for biodiversity and species monitoring as well. It's not a standard yet, but I mean, we can take the example of ecosystem accounting to develop standards for biodiversity monitoring, even at UN level. Digitalization and a new technology, something where we in EuropaBON focus heavily on to develop cost-effective methods for biodiversity monitoring. The funding issue, but evidently also capacity building, in particular in those countries where there is insufficient taxonomic capacity or governance capacity for setting up systems. My final slide before I give the floor to Hilde. So one of the tasks that we have in EuropaBON is to deliver to the Commission terms of reference for a monitoring coordination center. By the end of next year. This is something that we want to do with our network of EuropaBON members and collaborators. And we invite you to share with us your opinions, especially this afternoon in the breakouts. And what do you expect from such a center? How would you see it operating in the system? Where would we get the finance and so on? We want to co-design and get broad agreement and acceptance around such a center. And we really want to make the case also to convince the Commission to integrate it in its biodiversity governance framework in the future. How? Today and last month, we have started intensive dialogues around the different alternatives for a mandate, a governance structure, and a financing model. In terms of roadmap, I think by the end of next year, the project would like to deliver a set of options to the Commission, but it doesn't end there. I think Biodiversa, Hilde can dwell on that, is an excellent case for further testing and developing such a structure. But we have certainly in mind the next policy cycle of the EU from 28 to 35, where we set up new policies and where we establish a multi-financial framework. And there has to be room and budget for the establishment of and the permanence of such a center. Thank you.
Thank you. And so I will build on what Joachim just explained. Biodiversa is actually one of the main collaborators of EuropaBON, and it is building on an existing network. It's building on Biodiversa that already existed since 2008. It was at the time a pan-European network of biodiversity research programmers and funders. But now we have moved into the European Biodiversity Partnership, Biodiversa Plus, since 2021. And so we have expanded in terms of membership. So now we do not only have on board the research policy actors, but also the ministries of environment and the environmental protection agencies, obviously the ones that are funding and steering also the monitoring schemes. And that also allows us to make the bridge between research, monitoring and policy. So it's a quite complementary membership compared to EuropaBON. We also cover a broad range of activities. I will not go into all the details. Funding of biodiversity research is still at the heart of what Biodiversa is doing. Also, the majority of the budget still goes to that. But there's now an additional focus also on supporting transnational biodiversity monitoring. And we do that in collaboration with EuropaBON and also with the European Environment Agency and others. It's a co-funded partnership. This means that there's significant co-funding by the European Commission. The amplitude is around 165 million euros over 7 years. This means budget that can be used to fund research that will also indeed increase actionable knowledge, as was mentioned also by Vujadin, but it's also budget that can be used to reinforce the national and the subnational biodiversity monitoring schemes, to also close some of the gaps that have been highlighted, and also to maybe create a bit more sustainability for some of these funding schemes. When it comes specifically to these transnational biodiversity monitoring activities, it's a completely new component for Biodiversa. And it covers several activities that are basically also a blueprint of what we see in EuropaBON. We realize that when it comes to harmonization, we need to maybe prioritize. So you kind of do that for all levels of biodiversity, for all environments and for all taxa. So we start with some prioritization amongst the member states. There's a focus also on harmonization of protocols, methods and databases, improving data interoperability. Also some support to the development of new methods and technologies and approaches for biodiversity monitoring, all the way down to use of monitoring data, not only by research, but also by private and public decision-making. And so what I would like to stress here is that indeed we are not doing this alone. And also what we don't want to duplicate what is already existing. We want to build bridges between existing initiatives. We feel that we do have the reach to do that, and also help to navigate researchers and other stakeholders through a very complex landscape. I think one of the main added values that we could bring is also to showcase some best practices and services, including those from the national level. We heard the example of the Finnish Ecosystem Observatory, so what we could do as Biodiversa is upskill that and also increase the understanding and the potential of these approaches across Europe, and also to develop these common guidelines and practices. We can also assess to what extent some of the bottlenecks that have been identified by EuropaBON can be overcome through maybe the research course, but also through indeed reinforcing these national and subnational monitoring schemes, and also by promoting the coordination, the establishment of national coordination hubs. And then last but not least, indeed, we collaborate with EuropaBON to test concrete solutions proposed by EuropaBON. So they are like a very strong technical arm, and we then try to test it at the member state level. So So just a few more things. One of the things that we do to support also the establishment of the Biodiversity Coordination Center is that we have launched a survey with the partners. It was a survey just firstly written, and then we did some in-depth interviews, mainly to understand the national and the subnational biodiversity monitoring governance structures. What are the key actors? What do they do? How are they organized? Also to understand what are their main priorities at national level, subnational level, and also, for example, to assess if and how the EBVs could be used as a tool for harmonization. Because we heard about the potential of these EBVs, but then it's also important that these are used and taken up at the member state level and also promoted. And then also we use this to check on some biodiversa priorities. So it's an exercise that will be published at some point. We will also discuss this with the EuropaBON colleagues and others tomorrow. So it gives us a bit of information about how the biodiversity monitoring schemes are organized, coordinated, type of activities, budgets, but also we asked what the member states and the associated countries think about how things should be organized. Is it something that should be coordinated at the European level, at the national level, maybe a mix between the two, or maybe also it could be done through separate thematic coordination networks. And then also we asked what type of support could we provide as Biodiversa Plus. So these are just some highlights, but we have a lot of in-depth information on that. That will feed also the coordination center. And then the last thing is also, we are also now establishing what we call biodiversity monitoring pilots. These are very practical test cases that also link up with the showcases of EuropaBON. It's really to test with the member states and so with the countries to move towards harmonization of biodiversity monitoring programs on specific priorities. So we will launch a monitoring pilot on species, one on habitats, and one more at the level of governance. So if you would like to have a bit more information, I invite you to talk with Petri, because the Ministry of Environment Finland is also coordinating all the work on biodiversity monitoring within Biodiversa Plus. So he and also some of the French colleagues here and Swedish colleagues can elaborate on that. And then the last thing is just a bit of a summary. So when it comes to the EuropaBON and Biodiversa collaboration, we are very happy that we are key collaborators, so we can contribute to develop and to test these solutions at the member state level in different countries and in different contexts. And we can also help to increase ownership of solutions. That is very important if you want to have the member states and those that are funding and steering the schemes on board of the whole thinking, then I think we can play a role here. And then also, hopefully also through Biodiversa, we can at least initiate more sustainable and long-term context for biodiversity monitoring in Europe. And we would be very happy indeed if this is then also further supported and taken up by the European Commission in the legal setting. So I will leave it here, and if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer.
So there's one in the chat and says, how do EuropaBON and Biodiversa Plus coordinate with ongoing Horizon 2020 and Horizon Europe projects? Is there any network or framework for collaborations?
Currently there is, thanks to the Knowledge Center on Biodiversity, because they have an ad hoc monitoring working group, and that's exactly the purpose, to bring together all the initiatives that are focusing on biodiversity monitoring and to make sure that we are not duplicating, that we coordinate our actions. But it's also a soundboard to get some inputs from the policy level, so it goes both ways. But the answer is yes, luckily. So
yeah. Thanks, Hilde. And I think it's really fascinating, all the work which is now coming together. And did you get a feel from the survey already, sort of whether people favor sort of a European coordination or a member state sort of coordination at the national level?
I'm happy if my colleagues correct me, but I understood from the initial surveys that it seems to be like they prefer some kind of a strong steering from the European side, but at least also with some member state coordination. So at least these national coordination hubs would play also an important role, but possibly like a mix between the two would work best. or
Yeah.
at least some good interactions.
Thanks. This will be obviously also part of the next, so the panel discussion where I hope you, Joachim and Hilde, you can also contribute sort of, and that questions if there are to Joachim and Hilde can also be then placed. And then obviously also discussed further in depth at the workshops this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Okay, so let's move on then. We will start with the panel discussion now, and I'm really happy to introduce the panel speakers. The first one is Jan-Erik Petersen, who's the head of Spatial Assessment Team at the European Environment Agency based in Copenhagen, and he's a member of the European Advisory Board. In fact, all three speakers are members of the EuropaBON Advisory Board. Tim Hirsch, the second speaker, he's the Deputy Director and Head of Participation of the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, GBIF, and a member, as I said, of the Advisory Board in EuropaBON. And Richard Gregory is Head of Species Monitoring and Research at the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds. And yeah, I think we said if each of you could give a brief introductory statement, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Just to say, just to repeat, really excited to be invited to this really dynamic, amazing set of presentations and speakers today. We stand at a really important time in lots of respects in Europe, globally, with COP27 happening now, COP15 for biodiversity happening. We have the EU restoration law kind of in discussion. This is really vital times. So I asked myself some questions about the Biodiversity Monitoring Coordination Centre. And I think, first of all, much will focus on the key objectives of the centre. But I thought it was really important to think about the key values of this centre as well and how it would operate, because that's critical in the conversations we've had today. So some questions then, do we need this centre? Well, obviously we do. I mean, absolutely, obviously, but resounding yes from the information we've heard already. Is it timely and essential? Of course it is. And do we have the knowledge? Well, we have amazing expertise, you know, in this room, across Europe, across different organisations, governmental, scientific, academia, and in the NGOs. I think we have all those brilliant pieces. That they're not necessarily, we don't have all the pieces, and they're not necessarily all in the right places, but we have a fantastic setup there to make this really happen and make a real difference. I think our clarity of purpose is there. We have that perhaps for the first time emerging. Questions, though, that then in my head, a million questions come in terms of, is it a dispersed network? Is it bottom up or top down? You know, is this a centre that provides best practice in biodiversity monitoring, facilitates, supports, nurtures, monitoring requirements and expertise? Does it collate existing information alongside new? Does it then coordinate, synthesize, analyze that to produce products? Does it even go further to take that synthetic analysis with other information to understand drivers, model scenarios? It's a really exciting time, and this discussion starts that discussion around, you know, what is the unique selling point of this centre? What would it need to deliver? We have the key individuals. We have the EuropaBON project leading this whole question in a very able fashion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll pass over to Tim Hirsch.
Thanks very much indeed, and it's also a great pleasure for me to be here. I've attended quite a few now of these meetings of both Biodiversa Plus and EuropaBON, and I think it's great to see some of the issues, I think, starting to crystallize around, and following very much from what Richard just said, around what is the real value that needs to be added to what's already there. And I think it's always critical when we're starting to discuss and, if you like, invent something new, to really have that rationale in the front of our minds. There is always a temptation when creating something new that you want to do everything, and you end up repeating and reinventing things that don't need to be reinvented. So I think using this process really to identify what the gaps in the current capabilities are and the current coordination is going to be critical in designing the functions and the purpose and the setup and the governance of this organization. And just sort of looking at it as inevitably I do coming to these kind of meetings from the GBIF perspective, it's, I think, really critically important when looking across the European landscape that GBIF is visible not simply as a global institution that runs a global platform and supports standards that can be applied globally, but also consists of national and thematic platforms that themselves are tremendous repositories of expertise and support. And that is true, and it's not even in every country in the world, it's not even certainly not even in every country in Europe. But I think it's really important that that aspect of the national coordination that many of the GBIF national nodes do carry out is recognized and incorporated into this system. We're sitting in a country where there is tremendously good coordination between the work that's being done at the basic, the primary data level, right through up to the policy needs within the Belgian biodiversity platform, for example. I think we heard another great example today from Finland, where you also saw that integration right across the institutions, including, in that case, the Finnish Biodiversity Information Facility, the GBIF node, working with the other partners needed to get that monitoring and data flow right up, in this case, to the production of automated indicators. And I think the more that integration and coordination between what's already there in terms of national networks, the availability of support and expertise to take raw data coming through, including, for example, for the EU reporting processes, and if you like, getting rid of the excuses as to why isn't this raw data in the public domain? What are the barriers? And in the end, if all it boils down to is institutional mandate and finance, then let's deal with those, but not assume that we have to reinvent or invent systems and data flows that in many cases are available there with the right incentives and using the expertise that is available around networks such as GBIF. And I would just make one final point to finish, just referring back to the talk that Jake gave around the private sector. We do recognize that the private sector is a tremendous and generally untapped source of primary biodiversity data through, for example, monitoring for environmental impact assessments. But that data is being shared through into networks such as GBIF in some countries. And for example, in France, there is mandatory, there's a repository of data from EIAs that has to be shared into a national system, DPBio, which is currently coming straight into GBIF. There are other examples in both inside and outside Europe, Colombia, Norway, Spain, and other countries, where we are starting to see this private sector data, originating data, coming through into the common data pool. So let's build on what we've got and some of the processes that have been starting and not assume that we always have to invent this from scratch. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So filling the gaps and also providing the synthesis and building this on the shoulders of the many who are already out there. So I think that's one goal. And I think what Richard also said. So over to you, Jan-Erik.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. Thanks for the good presentations and all the thoughts that have come before this small intervention. Before this intervention of mine. I would like to pick up maybe on 4 points. One is the relationship between policy ambitions and data, because Europe has been very good, also in the biodiversity domain, but also generally, to set extremely high policy targets to move to a greener economy, control our climate emissions, and preserve biodiversity. But we have not seen a similar investment in the data that we need to do that successfully. So I think we need to recognize this as the European Union. We cannot just have funds without knowing what we do with them and what the impact is. And the second point is that we do have innovation and investment to gather data, and one central focus that also arises a lot of hope and expectations is the EU Copernicus program. So the satellite data that are increasingly coming and that we should be utilizing also for ecosystem biodiversity monitoring. We are trying to do that at the EA, but the key bottleneck is biodiversity in situ data. So we understand what the satellite tell us. So really, I would like to make a point here for on-the-ground survey, however you structure it. Without that, we can't also make the most out of the billions we invest in the satellites. And then the third point is really the question, do we go for a central or a distributed model? That's a big discussion that's been going on. And I think it will be a mix of both. But I'm in favor of give emphasis to the central component. For the reasons that we already have a very complex landscape that is not standardized. We have very patchy monitoring. We have some countries that are well resourced and have high policy attention that do a lot of good monitoring, and other countries where it's a very different situation. And it's for this, because of this difference between countries, that we have the EU cohesion funds, regional funding, etc. And I think we need to recognize this difference and create a central resource that also helps us to do things once rather than many times, as Biodiversity said. And speaking again from the experience of the European Environment Agency, it's extremely difficult to achieve standardizations even when it's meant to happen, for example, in reporting under the Habitats Directive. So a central function, wherever it's located, however it's created, is important, and I think that it needs dedicated funding to support it. And then just last point, which relates a bit to the standardization issue. It's clear that businesses, the private sector, are the actors that need to help protect biodiversity. It cannot be just the public sector or protected areas. But I think we need to really look into the information space and the data that is generated in relation to private sector activities. And we need to make sure that the generation of such data is standardized, comparable, fully documented, is representative of the space of where biodiversity is rather than where economic activity is, etc. So I think there's a lot of questions that we need to ask before we say this will be a strong solution. It will be a contribution, but I think we need to recognize it has inherent limitations. Just to get the discussion going. Thanks very much.
Okay, thanks. So you said, just to get some different views here, you are favoring a central resource, also with funding, obviously, also that this may help standardization, because we have a fragmented system at the moment. So just to juxtapose some of the things, then I also heard, obviously, well, we have to build on what we've got already. So these are obviously some things which we have to marry. We would like to open the floor for discussion. Please post your questions in the chat if you're online, and we're going to use obviously our cube. So here in the audience to get the discussion going. And otherwise, if no, please raise your hands, and otherwise we're just going to throw it into the audience. Okay, I'll try this.
Okay, this is yeah. So I'm Peter. I'm working at Antwerp Zoo Society, and I'm a geneticist. Something we haven't been talking about today, this morning, is genetic biodiversity. There was some mentioning of eDNA and a little bit of genetic diversity, but is largely lacking from this discussion, I think. Whereas it's very important for adaptation to climate change, for example, environmental change in general. And there are indicators possible. They are already published, but they are very little used. And there is also a large cooperation between conservation geneticists. It's called a coalition of conservation geneticists all over the world. So there are a lot of possibilities to take also into account this genetic diversity, biodiversity. And my question is, how do you see this happening within this monitoring center? Is that a possibility to include in that? Or have you thought about that in the first instance?
Well, just to say, I mean, my assumption, understanding the EBVs and our understanding of biodiversity, absolutely, it's a central part of the three components of the dimensions of biodiversity that we would wish to understand within species, the genetic element that you've described, the sort of species element that we've heard about quite a lot today, and the ecosystem element as well. So I see that as a central component of the initiative. It's not an area of my individual expertise, but I'm sure we'd want to bring that on board.
Yeah, thanks for that point. I think it's very relevant. I will just use it to illustrate where we stand, which is that we don't have reliable trends on many of the species groups in Europe or at national level. We are not able to utilize our satellite data to have thematically or ecologically interesting ecosystem extent accounts. So on key tasks that we have that are answering very important questions to society, we don't have the right data or the right resources to tackle. So this is an important question which I would like us to tackle also, but it just depends on what funding we have and who is best placed to address these issues. But thanks for the suggestion.
Otherwise, the ball can be thrown around. Maybe you want to pass it over up. And while you pass it over, we have a question from Helge Brühlheide for Jan-Erik. Concerning the relationship between centralized coordination of monitoring and distributed nodes, wouldn't it be one of the first tasks of a European monitoring center to identify the nodes we should keep? Are those that are already functional, such as the bird monitoring, the nodes we should combine from existing initiatives, such as habitat monitoring, and new nodes we currently do not have but would love to have, such as soil biodiversity monitoring? Then the next step would be to have targeted calls for forming and supporting these nodes. Otherwise, we will always start, like we did in EuropaBON, to be confronted with the entirety of the monitoring problem rather with doable parts.
I think the comment speaks for itself. It's a question of, there's nothing to object to it, but I do believe that we need to resolve this maybe before the Biodiversity Monitoring Center or Coordination Center would come into place, and I suspect that this will be a question that also EuropaBON or similar processes can tackle. But certainly, I spoke about the need for funding, and the importance that Europe knows what it does with its funds. We shouldn't just create a massive biodiversity central center without respecting what's available and making sure what's available works to the best possible way. There's GBIF, there is many other initiatives that need to be reinforced. And that's how I see also the function of a central center. I just think that there's areas that need reinforcement and that areas that need total building up. And I see a better chance if we have a central body with centralized EU funding, where I see more chances for for a strong investment. That's why I also propose a central body.
Yeah, thanks. And as you said, obviously next year will be exciting of EuropaBON to work with Biodiversa to actually get the terms of reference going, and probably this is one of the task lists. So we also posted in the chat the link to the BMCC note, so which is currently a draft and which is open for comments. So you can send this, it's at the very end, you can see how you can, it's a Google Doc where you can comment on, or you can send your comments obviously to us also afterwards while we're discussing it today. Okay.
Maybe just to come back on this point and perhaps maybe to possibly to correct an impression I might have given when I was talking about the importance of recognizing what's there at the national level. I'm actually agreeing with Jan Erik. I do think that the added role that this centre could and should play is going to be at the coordination and the guidance and the helping, the assistance to design good, effective monitoring programs based on the selection of EBVs, etc. And I think that is really where such a body can add value, rather than attempting, in a sense, to be the monitoring body itself. So I think looking at bringing together all the conclusions and the design suggestions that will come out of EuropaBON to then act as in a support role to ensure that the right components of biodiversity are measured, and to help them to drive priorities and funding to make sure that that happens. That's one of the things that you can say is really missing from the current very heterogeneous setup across Europe. So I'm actually agreeing that I think it's that central support and design that's probably could be the biggest added contribution of this centre.
Sorry, the cube is there, and I think we have several people in the audience. So there was here, and then I saw some people up there. So 1, 2, 3, and then down here, and 4, 5. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Just a very short question. If we get those perfect data, common agreed methods, and perfectly founded, next step probably is management, the applicability of the data. And for that, I think there is an urgent need to say something about the report, the Habitat Directive, under the 17th article, which is, it needs urgently to be improved, because if not, we are just assisting, very well informed about the loss of biodiversity, but we need to try to make urgently something like a evidence-based management of ecosystems.
We collect some, if you can throw it up, but you have to raise your hand so that somebody can, yeah, so maybe to the next level up there. You can actually throw it.
Can you hear me? Okay, hi. Sorry, can you remind me again what I'm supposed to do now?
Maybe just say your name and the question you have, and then next to you is also somebody who wanted to have a question.
I pass on to the one who has a
All
question.
right, okay. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thanks. I have a question for, I think, for all of them, and especially for Jan Erik, because Jan Erik, you are saying that, standardization is not always working. You refer to the Habitat Directive, and that you say, okay, you need to push a little bit more to, or you are more favoring at least a more central role. On the other hand, you are saying that in situ is key, because we cannot exploit all the, let's say, the satellite or the Copernicus, the satellite data which is there. But collecting in situ data is something that cannot be done from a central role. And on the other hand, I think in the morning there was the question, or there was the explanation about the Water Framework Directive. They have a lot of in situ data. There is a standardization protocol, but the data is not accessible. So my question is a bit, should that monitoring center not focus then still to do the standardization on the in situ level, but provide a number of tools that users or countries can use to scale up the data, create the necessary indicators, at least at country level, in a harmonized and a sustainable way?
Okay, let's take these two questions first, and who would like to answer?
Yeah, I was addressed. First of all, I put an idea out on the basis of my experience and my intuition of how EU processes work. So experience at the European Environment Agency and having observed development of common agriculture policy and many other policies over time. So this is an idea, and this is my proposal for what we should strongly consider in developing a proposal that policymakers are then meant to discuss. And this will involve the Parliament and the Member States, etc. So I'm confident that the network will reassert itself in any case. And it's important. The network is needed. The European Environment Agency also works with networks. But I say that we should not underestimate the challenge of moving in sync, moving in step, and making everyone move. And so you need to have investment and a central capacity to be able to do that. So we have been, for example, in the Habitats Directive reporting, we have been working with our topic center on biological diversity in support of the Commission to standardize, or to standardize the reporting under Article 17, for example. And it's a long process. And some countries cannot move as fast as others. So if we want to move as fast as possible together, we need to enable to provide capacity. Another example would be Green Land Cover. Green Land Cover is the main data set that we so far have been using in Europe. It's been financed by a mix of European and national resources, and it's actually national teams that generate the data. But there's a central training facility, and there's a team of interpreters and trainers that travels to the national teams to ensure they approach the national interpretation in a standardized manner. So these are the models that I would be thinking of. And so it's a mix of both, but even if you rely on national action, you need to have a central capacity that supports standardization and coordination.
Yeah, thank you. We did promise sort of, I'm watching the time a little bit, and it's flying already. So, but let's have, we had two more up there and then two in the front. Just very short questions, please, and then we gather them all. And then there was one other on the chat, yeah, or a few. Just a short question, please, yeah? And say your name, please.
Hi, my name is Alice Mouton, and I'm part of the Leibniz Institute in Berlin, in the biodiversity genomic projects. I was wondering, in these new biodiversity monitoring centers, how, I mean, it's kind of like a follow-up question from the previous one, but about this standardization and harmonization, how are you going to cope with the gap knowledge that is present across Europe? For instance, in genetics, there is a huge gap between Western European countries, Eastern European countries, Balkan, and maybe there is the same as well with like a taxonomists that are missing. There is a decline of taxonomists. So if we do standardization, how are you going to deal with the different resources that are within each country? Because we talk about standards, but standards for who? And is this monitoring centers are going to provide training for trainers, training for people, resources and stuff like that? It's more open question. So.
Yeah, thank you. So data standards and how this will vary or be across the EU. We are collecting the questions, and there was one in the top.
Hi, everyone. This is super cool. Thank you to the panel for a wonderful, stimulating discussion. My question really is for Tim. So you mentioned that there are existing platforms in Colombia, France, Norway, at the national level that are creating kind of data sharing platforms. Could you share a little bit about, any lessons learned or success stories, and to what extent those lessons are scalable, or are they very much kind of location or context specific? And I'm Naz from Systemic.
Thanks a lot. So the different platforms, a question to Tim. Then down here were two questions. Maybe you can pass it down Okay, let's have one next door, just at the side, but quick, please.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you to the panel. It has been just excellent to hear from you. I'm Carla Melo. I'm from Portugal, from environmental engineering and management company, and we've been helping the regional authorities to develop a monitoring program between Water Framework Directive and Marine Framework Directive to combine the monitoring that they need to do. So one of the problems is that two directives that are partially overlap an area, a marine area, have totally different data gathering that they need to do. So most of them would be just a little just to answer the other marine directive and so on. So could this be a really important target in this center to actually standardize some information that is being collected and the member states need to report in duplicate or slightly different, because this has really high costs to authorities to make a really important and good monitoring programs. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. This was about standardization also on data requests. Yeah, okay. So if you pass it down here.
Sorry.
Yeah. Maybe somebody else in between. Okay, we're having fun here for.
Okay. Thank you very much. My name is Egbert Rosen of the European Landscape Contractors Association. I was wondering, monitoring is of course one very important thing to know the state of the art, but I was also triggered by your remark about what could it do also as a sort of a, let's say, task that it could do, the mandate. And I was wondering, could this center also do binding, for example, recommendations in improving biodiversity situations?
Okay, thank you. So, Jonna, just this is the last one, just a very brief question. Okay, so these are binding recommendations, also how to improve biodiversity. Yeah.
I'm Joana Santana. I'm from EuropaBON team.
Joana, speak up a little bit.
Yeah, like this? Okay, that's funny. I'm from the EuropaBON team, and I'm mostly dedicated to gap analysis. This one are more for Richard and Jan-Erik. So regarding, I truly agree that we need an adequate dedicated funding for biodiversity monitoring center, but I'm quite skeptical to have a centralized system. And I would like to ask you, why do you think that it wouldn't work having a fully funded network of national bodies cooperating and sharing knowledge, guidance, and data? How do you think this wouldn't be better than to have a centralized system? Because for me, to have a network of national bodies would provide easily the acceptance from member states to providing monitoring and filling the gaps in a long term. So the monitoring, the gaps that we have, and to have capacity building will be much more interesting in the long term than to have something from the top telling which one would need to say. So sorry for being.
No, thank you, Joanna. I think this is really important. What you say is, would there be more, if I hear this right, would there be more ownership if it's distributed? And then also more flexibility. So this is the question. Obviously, this is where the two poles. And then I just add one question from the or comment. Is it from Francisco Moreira from the chat? Is it politically acceptable that EU and national governments continue to rely on NGO initiatives to monitor biodiversity? So you have got 6 questions, and you each have 1 or 2 minutes to reflect on those, and maybe give your comments to wrap up the panel. And maybe I start here with Jan-Erik, and then we go back again to Richard. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, thanks. I will not try to answer all of them. Fortunately, some are connected. just on the central point that I raised myself, central versus distributed. Please, I envisage a body that would have a governing board from all member states and other countries. I mean, I think about the EA model. We have a governing board, we have expert groups. Of course, you know, it shouldn't be a team that decides everything in a body itself. So I hope that would generate buy-in. I do agree that it would be very important that member states have ownership, and therefore there should be national teams. But there may be some countries that say, we can't do that. Can you fund a biodiversity monitoring team that helps us first time round, or can you send an advisor? Then there's a question, where are the data going to be stored? Distributed? Who does quality control? I'm afraid it's necessary everywhere. There's many clerical errors happen. So, you know, these things, just in practical terms, there has to be capacity. And I believe one reason for that capacity to be EU-funded and hence central is also the fact that it doesn't depend on the situation in the poorer countries, frankly. So I think that would be a key point. And then application, recommendations. That relates also to the point about management, ecosystem-based management. I think this Biodiversity Monitoring Center should focus on establishing the biodiversity and ecosystem evidence. We have already established bodies like the European Environment Agency, joint research centers, or the NGOs and researchers that look at what the data tell us. And I think we should separate it out so that we also doesn't become a potential danger to policymakers as such. I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Then we move over to Tim. There were some questions to you, but also whether there could be, I think there was this question of whether we could also standardize some of the requests for data. So how data could be standardized, but also how the request could be standardized, or, yeah.
Yes, thanks. So if I go first to the one that was addressed directly to me from Naz, just to clarify, when I was talking about the national efforts in the countries that I named, to support and in some cases mandate, the sharing of data arising from private sector surveys. Those were national efforts, but all of that data is going into a global data pool using global standards. So what is happening in some countries is that the right types of engagement is found, the right tools are found, and in a sense the right language and incentives are found, whereby the private sector in these cases is using existing standards to go on to existing, in this case, national platforms that then fit into, that then flow into the global platform. So it's not inventing anything new at the national level to support that data sharing in a closed environment. It's bringing in and engaging the actors in the private sector to make use and take advantage of what already exists. So I think the lessons there are that collectively, because be frank, I think we in GDIV traditionally don't particularly have the expertise of how to talk to the private sector. We need partners to help us do that. And it's that sort of synergy that I think can really start to make that data flow without having to invent anything particularly new. If I may, I would just want to pick up also on the point about training and capacity. I absolutely fully agree with that. And we recognize just within the standards that have become increasingly accepted across our community to use, for example, Darwin Core as standard terms to be able to share interoperable data. In all cases, when we try and engage in new regions, let's say within Europe and Central Asia, for example, we have programs, thanks to funding from, for example, Norway and Finland, to reach out to new partners in the Caucasus, in Central Asia. And we're seeing in every country, you can always find those enthusiasts who love dealing with open data and are ready to quickly absorb the skills needed to understand these standards and then to pass them on to new communities of practice within those countries and regions. So I think it's essential that that training capacity component is not overlooked in this process. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim. And then now to Richard, I think you have to also answer the question, is it politically correct to have NGOs, I mean, you're from RSPB, to carry some of the monitoring we had this morning, and how do we deal with this conundrum, bottom up, top down? Yeah.
Well, I think to address that question immediately, the NGOs are part of this active community within Europe, and we work together brilliantly across academia, across policymakers and government, and long may that continue, because I think we've shown, I thought Alena's talk and the work in Finland illustrates how we can use that citizen science data at the very highest level, and it meets all the quality standards. There's nothing perfect about birds as indicators, of course not, but we're showing it as an example. But I wanted to sort of bring it back to answer a couple of questions. Two things struck me about this conversation, and one of them was just language and our understanding of language. So I think we all have individual interpretations. So we talk about harmonization and standardization, and some people are sort of, oh, I mean, you're going to tell me what to do. But in a sense, what do we mean by that? To turn that around, we're saying, what are the enhancements in methodologies and improvements in methodologies which would achieve the items we want to achieve? Is the monitoring framework fit for purpose to answer the questions that are most important to our framework? So I think some of this is to stand back and say, what is it we wish to achieve? What is the question? Then you come back to the information, the data collection, the kind of harmonization and standardization at that level to answer that question. We could get lost in this conversation about the terminology. Of course we could, and that's what struck me. And I think the other thing that struck me was Jan Erik mentioned a sort of a center focus, but people sort of picked up on that as well. But I think the importance is to say, well, we want a European framework that has national elements to it and a central component. What we're discussing, I think, might be the emphasis that you have towards the core compared to all the dispersed parts. And I think I might be misrepresenting Jan Erik here, but the focus on the centre is really important, I think, as we move forward, because it provides that sort of flagship, the leadership, the expertise that others can then rely on. So we aren't reinventing wheels around 30, 40, 50 countries in Europe. We're using the expertise. Individuals in the community can lean on the expertise in the centre to say, well, I'm developing this methodology. Can you tell me, where has it worked? Where is best practice? So I think it's that kind of standard bearer, the flagship, the people who are developing that clarity, which is important. And finally, I think we need to sort of walk before we run. So I think it's about saying, what are the stepping stones to develop a new system? We want to aim high, but at the same time, I don't think we want to aim too high. So I think, a focus on sort of much more tangible objectives that we know we can achieve around species and habitats for some of those flagship species and habitats would be important to take us forward, so that we aren't paralyzed, but by the task ahead of us, which is a big task, but we're capable of delivering it, I think, collectively.
Yeah, so in summary, in terms of technical mandate for a potential biodiversity monitoring center, we addressed things like the technical tools and databases for data collection. We mentioned the need for capacity building as something that should be on the technical mandate. And most agree that representatives of conservation authorities at national levels should be there as well. We focus on yearly reporting as an ideal situation. Now, something that there was disagreement among the group, and it relates also to governance, was to what extent methods and techniques and sampling designs should be something coming from the top down, or if different countries should be allowed to keep their singularities in terms of approaches, and then there should be an harmonization at the EU level, but allowing different approaches in different countries. So there were different views on this specific aspect. Then in terms of deployment and implementation, funding was considered a key. Okay? Funding both from the government, but also maybe from the private sector as well, and funding allocated to the new center itself, to the organizations that carry out monitoring, and eventually funding needed for new technologies or new tools. That, along with deciding on the structure and the organization, were considered by participants as the more important immediate action items to implement. Over.
Super. Thanks, Francisco. Yeah, that's a great summary there. So yeah, well noted those points, and certainly this always we're discussing this issue of how much sort of standardization enforcement sort of top down versus bottom up, right? This topic was always coming up, so that's certainly something that we really have to consider going forward. So yeah, thank you once again, and we'll move over then to the breakout group number 2 from Tore. The floor is yours.
Yes. Can you hear me all? Yes. Okay, thank you. So yeah, I'm here to report from our second breakout group, and we had a very nice mix of people. Like, we had some practitioners, some researchers, but also people from the private sector, which was very interesting. And we kind of shared the common motivation, I guess, also to just also learn about this whole process. So we all, like, none of us didn't really consider themselves like experts in what it should be, but we wanted to also learn from everyone else. So that was a great opportunity. And in terms of the mandate, we kind of, and I think we envisioned the BMCC as some sort of like knowledge hub that that integrates different data and information, that engages in the harmonization of data and metadata, and facilitates kind of the exchange of tools and best practices, maybe between different organizations and networks. And yeah, as we were moving on to thinking about the challenges and opportunities, we quickly realized that what looks like a challenge from one perspective is an opportunity from another perspective. So we had some interesting discussions there. But like a main point was to make use of really existing infrastructures or agencies, maybe at the national level, but also maybe in research and other places, because there's a lot of expertise and we want to avoid like to have parallel structures. And then for the last task, we were struggling the most, because we realized, oh, it's not that easy to actually plan this thing, and you don't just plan a European center on a daily level. But there we really wanted to emphasize the participatory process, that at every stage different actors should be involved, and that shouldn't only be limited to the ones that you suggested as ones that we should consider, but also other European research infrastructures and also indigenous people and local communities should be included. Yeah, I don't know if anyone from my groups want to add to this, but overall this was a nice experience and we had very interesting discussions. Thank you, everyone.
Super, thank you, Tore. Yeah, really appreciate that, and yeah, nice that you also had a very good mix of people in the room. I think that's also what we were hoping to achieve, but it's always not always possible. But that's really great. So and thanks too. I think I was noticing that in some of the boards online that many of the groups were also adding a lot of other people into the other column. So this is a very good point as well, that there's a lot of other.
Actually, can I quickly add? We also got the feedback that everyone was really interested in what is coming out of this. So it would be great to see what the other groups have, or like how you somehow synthesize or condense this whole big thing into one outcome. But I guess that also feeds into the PDF or the Google Doc that you shared with us, doesn't it? Yeah.
But we'll touch on that a little bit maybe as we wrap up at the end.
Yeah, thanks.
Super, great. So then we'll move on to group 3, and Alejandra, over to you, please.
Yeah, thank you. We have a small but very dedicated group that work very hard in the Easy Retro boards and also in the Google document. We also have the discussion about about governance, whether it's a good idea to have a top-down approach, because, for instance, this will left out some non-European countries. And if we want to create something that it covers the whole of Europe, that is maybe not a good idea. The same for bottom-up approaches, because not all member states have the same capacities for monitoring. So there was quite an agreement about that model of hybrid governance system will facilitate coordination and communication between the stakeholders at different levels, and that would be the ideal governance system for the BMCC. And this BMCC with that governance could build on existing efforts from member states or different scales, let's say, and will work on providing standards. So some of the tasks, more on the technical part, will provide some monitoring standards on monitoring, but also help the design of pipelines for data integration. It will provide training for citizen scientists, but also, for instance, for taxonomists. And it would also help member states, NGOs, and different stakeholders towards the transition to the use of novel technologies for monitoring. But overall, one of the main tasks will be to act as a link between stakeholders and facilitate coordination and communication between them. So it would be kind of a meeting point between existing stakeholders and users, etc. And then, well, the participants of group number 3 made a fantastic job in designing the roadmap towards the setting of the BMCC. So there are lots of ideas there, very concrete steps for immediate action, and then intermediate targets, and overall a final vision for this group. So I just encourage you to go there, because there's a long list of it. I just want to thank the group, because they were they were hard. They gave lots of ideas, and yeah, it was a very nice experience.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ale. Yeah, really appreciate it. And even if you have a smaller group, but I think we were noticing a lot of still a lot of great responses on the boards, and so thanks very much also for the effort on that. So now we will turn over then to group number 4. That's Toke. I believe you'll be reporting back.
I will. Thanks, Ian. And well, first of all, thanks to the group for very valuable inputs and great level of engagement. I will just add a few points that I've haven't maybe been mentioned so far. I think one of the discussions or potential disagreements in our group related to the technical mandate was to what extent the BMCC would be responsible for collection of additional data and not just collate data from existing monitoring programs. I think that's a point worth further attention. And similarly, I think with respect to analysis, whether the BMCC itself should have the capacity to analyze and report on these analyses, or whether the analysis should be carried out independent of the BMCC. With respect to capacity building, I think there was a lot of support for the BMCC to have a central role in organizing capacity building events like workshops and intercalibration exercises, both when it comes to the collection of data and the integration and storing and providing access to that data. When it came to governance, I think there was also an interesting discussion about the importance of governance-related challenges and opportunities compared to the technical and financial ones. That actually, I think there was agreement in the group that the challenges associated with the governance, or the kind of social constraints on defining and implementing a BMCC, should definitely not be underestimated. That the technical challenges might be solvable, and that the financial challenges should maybe not take the first seat. It should really be about the governance related challenges. We also have quite a lot of input also to the last session in the Google Doc, and I can't help mention that somehow I think we were a little constrained by the default muting of participants in the online forum. It did kind of hinder some of the discussion, but we have quite a lot of input into the EC retro boards and the Google Doc. So I think that's all I have to say, unless anyone from the group would add anything.
Thanks, Torke, and I'm sorry that we had this still in because some other groups solved it somehow, and yeah, I'm sorry about this then. So because obviously, yeah, we wanted you to also communicate it orally. Thanks a lot for sharing this, and that's really good. Okay, thanks.
Great. So we'll then thank you, Torke. We'll pass then the final presentation over to group number 5, which was chaired by Miguel, and I believe Sven Braupmann is going to do the response back. Thank you.
Okay, now you should hear me, right? Okay, thank you. Yeah, well, as the last one, it's a bit difficult now to add to the many brilliant ideas and statements before, but I will try to wrap it up and to add some more to spotlights to what has been said before. So I think in our group, we were also quite a small group. It seemed everyone was really interested and liked to contribute, and it was good. We had the chance to do this both orally and with written opinions. So we got, I think, an interesting overview of different ideas, what a BMCC could look like. We discussed the importance of avoiding, like, and I think that hasn't been mentioned before, about avoiding overlap or duplication of tasks and responsibilities, both at the European level, for example, with the Knowledge Center for Biodiversity, but also at the national levels, for example, existing biodiversity monitoring centers at national levels that might already be in place. That includes also to avoid funding the same aspects under different frameworks. So this has also been an aspect that we discussed. Existing international and national level programs should be included in the process of building a BMCC in order to be able to contribute to and to profit, of course, from it, just according to their capacities and needs, which might be quite different depending on the country or also the taxon in question. So we think we would need centralized structures, but also federal elements, given like bottom-up input. I think we heard about that before by some of the contributors. So both should be incorporated in the design of a BMCC. Of course, funding is one central aspect that has to be assured at different levels, and it's crucial for the participation of representatives of national monitoring entities, and also the private sector should be involved to some extent into that. I took personally as one take-home message that we need to use the BMCC to provide guidance and training, of course, but also to trigger knowledge exchange and to stimulate synthesis of existing data analysis, like from birds or habitats directive reporting, for example. But we also need to build up new structures and capacities in countries or for taxa where they're not yet existent. So it could have like a double role in this case. And well, the BMCC could or should become some sort of platform of exchange for different players in monitoring, for example, sharing and using best practice examples to enhance monitoring in the member states, for example, to implement new schemes and or support existing ones. And it could help to trigger or support supranational and or cross taxonomic projects. So that's something that hopefully adds a bit to what has been said before. I personally like this part and this exercise a lot because it was easy to discuss the different views, and I think there's much more that will be shown in what has been written and recorded. You can look forward to that. And yeah, I think it's one important thing might be as a last point that we need a participatory process to keep the monitoring organizations and people responsible for monitoring involved in the whole process. I think that has been mentioned before, but I'd like to stress that as a last point. So thanks a lot for the opportunity. And yeah, if my group would like to add something, please go ahead.
Great, thanks very much, Sven. You added a lot of additional points there, I think, so that was great. And certainly this, your first point about avoiding duplication of tasks at the EU level, I think that's certainly one important one to keep in mind. So yeah, thanks very much for that. It was great feedback. Super, so then now we'll switch back to the reporting back from the 3 in-person breakouts that we had in the afternoon, and the first one would be from Enrique and Bruno, and you could actually use the podium. So you'll be reporting back. Super.
Yeah. So we had very deep and nice discussion, so it's very hard to summarize this. So I will focus on the points that were not mentioned before. One thing that in terms of agreement for everybody was that fair data was a key and that it should be developed first. And then when it started to talk about how far we go, then there were some disagreements, but the main idea was that going to the indicator level was a key for communication. And this indicator should not only be about biodiversity indices, but also about the quality of the data indices. So to have indicators on where are the gaps and how to fill them. In terms of capacity building, the knowledge center was mentioned as a primary idea. And we also had many discussions about the governance with the problems between having centralized and decentralized thing. The big things on top of funding is also to have an authority and to have some feedback from the different, to see that what comes out as indicators is implemented by the European community and the government to make sure that the motivation keeps there. And that's a big incentive also, not only the funding. And just to close, we should also get inspired from other initiatives that are already doing some great stuff in terms of harmonization of the data, such as what is done in the climate community or in the regional sea consortium. So there are already things existing, and maybe we could get inspiration from there, making sure that in order to have harmonization going forwards, the results and what is done with the data must be interesting, so that people are want to do some harmonization. So that's the best way to do that. But the authority is also needed to push on this harmonization. Otherwise, there are some. I mean, people fear that we might have too much independent monitoring systems that are not consistent with each other, and that would be an issue with the BMCC. So sorry for all the things that I couldn't say in these 2 minutes, maybe a little bit more, but the discussion was very rich.
Yeah, thanks very much. I liked also, your point about looking at other communities, like the climate community. That's certainly really a great example when you think of all the climate data, the reanalysis data and so forth that they're making available, and the standards and formatting that they're using. So that's a really good point. Super, great. Then we'll then turn it over to the second group that was led by Daniel and Joanna. Pateri will be giving the feedback. Thank you.
Okay, so thanks for the group for very good discussion. We had also nice group, and a lot of good points came out. I also tried to highlight some of them here. So we started off this dreaming of this wonderful future of BMCC, and it was really great. We were discussing about the standards that should be in place, fair data that is obvious for everyone. Then there was quite interesting discussion of the possibilities of remote sensing versus in situ data, and the role of GBIF and EA Copernicus services in that. That may be something that was not mentioned yet. Then we had a discussion of that GBIF model. Data model is interesting to see how far it can be extended to cover different dimensions and data types for this biodiversity monitoring. And then it was highlighted also that maybe more facilitation is needed than data storage from the BMCC. So that's all about this data aspects and the technical things. Also one of the points was highlighting that the more bottom-up approach there is, the more harmonization and calibration is needed in space and time. That is a challenge that has to be overcome somehow, and it needs collaboration of these central and decentralized networks. Then when we came to this reality, how to get this implemented, it was same discussions. It has been in different groups already, that we also were discussing of this top-down versus bottom-up, how to find the best balance between these different approaches. Anyway, this national approach was highlighted, that every network must come together to these national hubs. There was also quite a lot of this highlighting of the importance of the international networks like GBIF and the national nodes in that sense, which can play an important role for these national discussions to provide these networks together. Also the role of the data validation was mentioned, and also the variety of these different coordination models, that in addition to the ministries of environments which were mentioned, also NGOs are very important, as we have heard already today. Then finally, about the governance, there were some challenges of this funding model, that how to get funding. Central hub is great if it has also good resources to run the processes, but at the same time the opposite was that those local networks who are really doing the observation and based on the voluntary observations, they also need to get long-term funding. And it was good to hear that this motivation was raised up. I think that's really crucial to take into consideration. Yeah, and also the EEA's experiences of the European Topic Center collaboration was highlighted to be an important option. Also national experts highlighted that strong guidance and standards will help member states in their work. For example, implement Article 17 monitoring and habitat monitoring. And also that central body like BMCC could really steer and support member states to watch over balanced development of monitoring schemes. And just finalize this roadmap, we also thought that maybe one option could be to get some kind of European Parliament funding for proof of concept to demonstrate comparable to the pollinator initiative to test and develop this model a little bit further before finalizing any development paths. And also it was important to finalize this benchmarking of the landscape, what's going on, what kind of monitoring networks they are in place, and how to learn from GBIF, eyeball different initiatives which have been having same challenges. Yeah, and also finally, it was also mentioned that this genetic diversity hopefully will be in place in the end of this development. So we have to take that into consideration as well. And IT structures, working groups, and a governance model for coordination and the different experts groups to come together. So a lot of things. Thanks for the group and the discussions.
Super, thank you, Petteri. Yeah, I think it was also, I heard you mention GBIF several times, and I think that's also an important point to raise here as well. Yeah, what the kind of role that they should be playing. And Tim's not in the room right now, but obviously he would be glad to speak about that. But we can we'll be certainly talking with GBIF further on all of this. But yeah, thank you very much for that feedback. And now the final group was led by Joachim and Maria. I think Maria will then give the feedback on that. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
Yeah, we had also a very nice group and very diverse with people from industry and NGOs. This was very nice. And the part of the mandate was very interesting because people went to really very detailed, concrete tasks on mandates, and then this create this enormous amount of information there. And then we aggregate it and assess which one was the most important. And this was data integration and also data sharing and centralized data sharing. Also the idea of, I think that this didn't come out, of creating new data products. And this that I have here in almost all groups, this idea of the capacity building. Then in the discussion of governments, we kind of finally agree on that would be interesting, kind of a combined approach between centralized that could provide the standardization, harmonization, protocols and funding, but enough decentralized that don't disengage the people or that have some type of that the people keep engaged on the center. And this was also reflects on the third exercise when we were talking and discussing the role of each organization. Then you could see that all these organizations were plays a specific role in all the process of biodiversity monitoring, from the research institutions providing new standard protocols, from the private sector providing innovation, also the idea of the EU providing funding. And I think that this reflects quite well this idea that all the actors should be involved. And also the idea of that there is some workflows happening that it's good to keep as they are because they are working and that they are examples for what could be in the future. In terms of last point, the roadmap was a little bit more difficult to discuss because not knowing quite well what was the mandate, then was more difficult for the group to define what would be the roadmap. But then we had again a very nice discussion about if the center only provides data, if and then again we went a little bit to a more mandate discussion about if only collects data, harmonize, also analyze. But yeah, I think that it's all captured in the boards. Yeah. And yeah, thank you for the group. It was very nice.
Super. Thank you, Maria. Thanks very much. That's great. So I think that concludes our reporting back here on the breakout activities this afternoon. And unless there is a burning question or point somebody wants to raise, then we thought we might hand the floor over to our colleagues just for a final wrap up. Yeah, we thought maybe Hilda, I don't know if you have any reflections on your business, the private sector meeting. You're still, I walked by the room, I saw everyone was standing up and it looked like you were, was quite active. But if either yourself or Enrique would like to say a few final few closing words.
So for now, I cannot report back because they were still in full action. But it looked like, yeah, there were lots of ideas. So I'm pretty sure there will be some very nice ideas coming out of it. So when it comes to the workshop that we have there will be a report and we will translate it into concrete actions for Biodiversa. So we'll share that with you in due time. But just on a general note, I think we are super happy with today's event. We were already very happy with the EuropaBON Biodiversa Plus collaboration, but today I think it was for us a moment also to feel the excitement and the momentum, and that is something that we will build on, and we will reflect on that tomorrow in an internal meeting and see how we can take it from here. Not just to wait for another year to do something, but to really build on what we have today. But from what I picked up when I just came in, I think we are getting there slowly. Maybe we shouldn't go too quickly, so at least from time to time check back with all the stakeholders. But yeah, I'm confident that we will get there and that we will also have the EuropaBON outcome in time. So yes, so many thanks for everyone for participating, and also to the EuropaBON colleagues for the fantastic collaboration. So thank you.
Thank you, Hild. And yeah, I think that one of the things that comes out from the workshop is a bit the huge challenge ahead. We heard from several of the working groups when we discussed the future, the steps that needs to be taken to make this vision of an European Biodiversity Monitoring Center successful. It was challenging. It was challenging because it's a big challenge, and we heard, and he'll just mention the importance of going progressively, having a high ambition, but progressively, not trying to do everything at the same time. And I think it is somehow today also show that this could be possible, because we had so many people participating remotely and also here in presence, that work together through this day, trying to develop this vision in common. And what better example is this collaboration between EuropaBON and Biodiversity Plus? You know, it shows that when you bring these communities together and they collaborate, I think we can really make progress. And so, yeah, I wanted to thank all of you for your time here, and I wanted to thank the coordination team for this workshop, and that Aletta and Ian from EuropaBON side, and I guess Hilda and Anna Schenk from Biodiversa that really made this possible. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful evening and trip back to your homes. Thank you. Oh, there is a reception. There's still a reception, Hilda. Maybe.
Yes, you're all kindly invited to the reception, of course. So.
Is it outside now?
Yeah, it's outside.
It's outside. Okay.
Okay, and may I just add to this? So the biggest thanks go obviously to Hannah and Evelina and Lise and Jessie for being the spearhead masterminds behind all this, and for keeping this all running. So thank you very much to you. And now we can have the second birthday party for our EuropaBON and have some drinks. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks again. Thanks to everybody online as well, and all the chairs and participants today. So thanks very much, and have a wonderful evening. Yep. Thank you.